Okay, we've reached the part of the lesson where it's basically we're just going to go back over some of the more important points of that way. In fact, let's go back and let's read the two texts that we used and based our lesson from, and recognize that what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount was kind of just broad brush, but his instruction in Matthew the 19th chapter, as recorded by Matthew, provides us a little bit more detail. So, in Matthew the fifth chapter, and we're going to do verses 27 through 32. Okay, uh, let's see. James Fox, would you read that for us, please? Matthew, the fifth chapter, verses 27 through 32. Nice and loudly so everyone can hear you.
Heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body should be cast to hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body should be cast into hell. If he put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery.
Thank you. Daniel Haley, would you read Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, please?
The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two of them shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Then they said to him, Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery.
Thank you. Okay, so I thought it was important that we go back and just review very briefly on Sunday, and that's what we did. What God intended marriage to be. So I think it gives us a greater appreciation for why, as Malachi says, he hates divorce. But to also help us to better understand some of the things that were happening in the Old Testament, Jesus making reference to a commandment in Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, verses 1 through 4, where Moses said, okay, you're going to divorce your wife, you got to give her a certificate of divorce. And what Jesus said about that was, of course, well, that's not the way it was intended to be. But because you were so hard-headed, meaning hard-hearted, he allowed you to do that. And what was said in Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, the fourth verse was completely missed by the Pharisees as they were continued to pass along that traditional treatment, and it was never a part of God's law. Exodus 20:14, do not commit adultery. And what the Pharisees were doing was, by their continuing to carry forward a perversion of God's law regarding marriage and allowing men to issue a certificate of divorce. There was a reason for that, and that was so that the woman would have some document that she no longer belonged to any man. Okay? The unfortunate part of that was that they did not realize the impact that that had on her. Women, historically and traditionally, along with their children, are the most hurt by a divorce, hands down. Because usually what happens when a woman is divorced, now she is sometimes in dire straits, trying to support her and her children. And of course, many of them, all through the time, had to depend on other people to help them along. And especially for the Israelites, they were really in dire straits, because the only way that she could continue to be supported was still to be a part of that Israelite family. And so that required her to go marry another man. Well, in God's eyes, when that husband sent that woman away with that certificate of divorce, he was causing her to commit adultery. And that's what that verse was about. That's why Jesus said, you cause her to commit adultery, because she's left helpless. Okay? So what Jesus is doing now, he's saying, look, this is what was allowed, but I'm telling you this is the way it needs to be. And he reminds them that from the very beginning, God intended man and woman to be joined for life. And that no, a husband could not send away his wife, even with a piece of paper saying that she was divorced, could not send her away without causing grave consequences to both her and any other man who happened to marry her in a succeeding marriage. Okay? So, excuse me. So what Jesus was saying was, look, there's only one reason that God will approve or will allow. I know we refer to it as a scriptural divorce, but really, if you understand how God feels about it, there's no such thing as a scriptural divorce. There is a God-allowed divorce and still be in good spiritual standing, and that is only if there is adultery involved. And yes, we've come up to the modern times now, and now we realize Galatians 3:28 says that there's neither male nor female, neither Greek nor Jew, okay? Slave or free man, we're all one in Christ. That means the law applies equally to both spouses, okay? So if a woman divorces her husband for anything other than sexual immorality, it's just the same consequence as if the man divorces the woman for something other than sexual immorality. And that's what Jesus is telling them. Remember, every bit of teaching that Jesus is doing from now on impinges on, or the foundation comes from, what chapter, what verse? Matthew 5:20. And that says, unless your righteousness exceeds or surpasses that of the Pharisees and the scribes, you shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is saying that's what the Pharisees did and taught. That's what the scribes did and taught. That's what they did in old. You are to exceed their righteousness. There was nothing righteous in what they were teaching and what they were doing as it related to divorcing for any reason. But as the Pharisees would do, of course, as we read in Matthew the 19th chapter, they're still testing Jesus. They're testing Jesus. Master, is it true that you can divorce your wife for any reason at all? And there's not much doubt in my mind that the Pharisees that were asking that question probably heard what he said on the Sermon on the Mount. But they're continuing to be antagonistic, continuing to test him. And they remember what he said on the Sermon on the Mount. Because Matthew, the 19th chapter, Matthew's account of Jesus' further teaching comes sometime after that. And so what Jesus is telling them is that there is only one reason to divorce a spouse, to terminate a marriage, and that is for unchastity, fornication, adultery, whatever version you are reading, sexual immorality. And why is that the case? Because the spouse who commits adultery has profaned the very vow that they made to their mate. And that was to what? To remain faithful for as long as they both should live. And I know that's using today's terms. But there's, I don't doubt that even in Old Testament times, there was some kind of a vow that was made, at least by some of the mates anyway. And so that vow or that joining was a injury to that very vow that they made when they were joined together. And remember, God is the one that joins. And what Jesus is saying, no matter what the law, the local law is, or the custom is, or whatever, it's only God who can dictate the provisions for how marriages are to be terminated. Really sets the parameters for how marriages should be engaged in, too. And so Jesus is making it very clear that whatever you had heard from the past times, whatever you learned from the scribes and the Pharisees about what was allowed, was not what was allowed by God. And therefore, you need to stop it. Now, obviously, verses 29 and 30, okay? Obviously, there's great hyperbole there. Hyperbole is when you make a really bold, exaggerated statement to make a point. Okay? But it's not to be taken literally. The history of religion, quote unquote, at least in this country, tells us that some people thought that Jesus was taking it literally. He was giving it literally. And so the punishment in some countries is they lose a hand or whatever. See? What's that? Well, I suppose it would, just like they cut off the hand of a thief too. But that's certainly not what because God doesn't want any person deliberately mutilating their body. Okay? Take the tattoos out of your mind. We're not talking about that. We're talking about lopping off limbs or whatever. Okay. The point being is that it's not to be taken literally, but Jesus is making a point. What did he say? Better to lose that eye if it's doing something that leads you into sexual desire, or better to lose that hand if it's also leading you astray. Better to lose a body part than have your whole body burn in hell. And here he's talking about Gehenna, which we've talked about in the past, is that part of hell which is described as eternally in torment and torture forever. And so Jesus is saying, If you are practicing divorce for any reason at all, you need to stop it. Get it out of your life, get it out of your thought process, because that's not what it's supposed to be. And you run the risk of condemning yourself to hell if that's what your attitude is about terminating a marriage by anything other than unfaithfulness of one of the partners. The only other way that a marriage can be terminated, obviously, the marriage is dissolved, obviously, is when one of the spouses is deceased. That's almost common sense. But you would be amazed at how some people have distorted even that. Okay. Now, let's go. I want us to just kind of take a look at what we have. What's the relationship that Jesus is making between lust and adultery? What is the reason that he talks about lusting and adultery within the same context? Remember that Jesus' teachings are all about heart issues. Okay? And if a man lusts after a woman, or a woman lusts after a man, that's where the adultery starts. Because if they follow through on that lusting, they're going to commit adultery. And remember, adultery is any form of marriage, of sexual relations between two people, one of whom is married and not to the person they're having the relations with. And yes, it is a sexual relationship. That's specifically what it's addressing. That's why the modern versions use the term sexual immorality. Can a person, can a male, can a man who is married to another woman have an affinity toward another woman without committing adultery? Sure they can, if they don't follow through on it. Remember what we talked about? Look, but don't linger, right? Look, but don't linger. But the point being is that it is very, very difficult, men, all of us raise our hands, okay, that if we have a penchant to ogle a woman, it's going to lead us down the wrong path, okay? It's going to lead us down the wrong path. And that's why Jesus says not to even start there, because that's where the adultery starts. Because it's what is conjured up in your mind when you look at another woman attractively from a sexual desire standpoint. Okay. So let's just summarize here. Remember that only God has the authority to dictate the definition and the terms of marriage. Okay? We're not going to get into all the distortions of modern day marriages. Only those, now look, this is what's really important. Only those who are willing to submit to what God says should ever get married. Even Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. He says, if you are burning with desire, you better marry somebody so that you not fall into some sexual impropriety or inappropriateness, okay? But the point being is that if you can live celibate all your life, then don't get married. But if you contemplate marriage, think about what God has said that it's supposed to be. It's a lifelong commitment, for better or for worse. Unfortunately, the women usually get the butt end of the worse. Okay? But if the women, if two people do submit and are submitting to God's dictates regarding marriage, then they can be assured that God will join them together. And how does he join them together? Male and female, man and woman come together, one flesh. Two people, but one flesh. And there is a verse or a passage of scriptures, a group of scriptures in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, that Paul talks about men who have a tendency to go visit a prostitute. And what does he say in there? He said, do you not know? And he's talking about keeping the Holy Spirit, the temple of the Holy Spirit, pure. He said, do you not know that if you lay with a prostitute, you have been joined together as one flesh? That's only supposed to be the relationship between a husband and wife. Okay? And so that relationship of one flesh is God created, and so very, very important. God joins a man and woman together for life. There's only two conditions that a marriage can be severed. One's the death of a spouse and the unfaithfulness of one of the spouse. But remember this, the part about adultery, the part about the unfaithfulness of what? It says she may divorce. God's not saying you have to. And I do have friends, personal friends, who went through some rocky times in their marriage, and one of the partners was unfaithful, but they kept their marriage together. They forgave whoever the guilty party was, and they went on and had very successful marriages. So it's just that a spouse may divorce, may send away. That's the biblical term for divorce, is to send them away. And that person who divorces for adultery is then free to marry, assuming that the person, their second husband or wife, is not an adulterer. Okay? And the best advice that Paul gives to widows is to marry again, but only in the Lord. Now, I know that that's no foolproof system, but we're talking in general terms now, and generally speaking, if you marry in the Lord and you are a widow, they're typically more advanced in years. I know we have young widows, I understand that, but the point being is that you are taking on a mate, as Betty Lawson did. She and Hank lost their first mates, and they married each other. They married in the Lord, because that is usually a better prescription for having a successful second marriage than the alternative would be. That does not mean that there aren't exceptions. Okay? And what Jesus' instructions are regarding verses 29 and 30 is it's better to abide by God's instructions, and Matthew 19th chapter also, by the way, he says that when he talks about, some have become eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. Better to abide by God's instructions on this matter than to be eternally in hell. And remember, the problem begins where? In the heart. In the spiritual heart, which is, okay, this up here. Okay? Now, okay. So just enough time for some questions and answers. And remember, we're not doing what ifs. Okay? That's better handled in a counseling session. And I'd be happy, the elders would be happy to meet with anyone who, if there's some situation that you want to discuss, be happy to meet with you. But are there any questions or comments related to the matters that we have discussed regarding the text? Good. That's a sign of a great teacher. I know that. Beg your pardon? Okay, then let's take out our questions. Question sheets. And again, I will use the individual study guide to go by since they include all 6 of the questions with a couple of extra questions. But I'll tell you, the first 5 questions are the same on both lists. Okay, so all right. In the 10 commandments, I'm always struck by this fact that they keep saying the 6th commandment, the 7th commandment. It doesn't matter which commandment it is; it's one of the commandments. Okay, but in the 10 commandments, what did the 7th commandment say? Do not commit adultery. Now that's in both Exodus the 20th chapter verse 14 and Deuteronomy the 5th chapter verse 18. And also remember Exodus 20:17, because there's another one on top of that that just drives the point home, and that is God said, "Don't covet your neighbor's wife." So he makes it loud and clear that being unfaithful to or going after, I guess, any other man's wife is unrighteous. It is evil. It's sinful. Okay. Now, if you're jotting down the page we only had two book pages, so the first 5 questions are all on. Actually, the first 6 questions are all on page 236. What's the relationship between adultery and lust? Lust can lead to adultery. Okay. Can you commit adultery without lusting? If you turn to someone who is not your mate, your lawful mate in God's eyes, you turn to them to have sexual relations with them, that is lust. Okay? That's by definition, that's what lust is. Okay? It's acting on the sexual desire that you have. And remember that adultery is consensual sex. Believe it or not, there have even been some women have been taken to the task that got raped. Okay, well, you committed adultery. Well, we know that's absolutely a distortion of the truth. Okay, number 3, how do you deal with anything that would encourage forbidden desire? What are you going to do? Get it out of your life. Remove it. Okay? Tear it from your mind. Right? It takes a lot of prayer and sometimes takes a lot of discipline. Absolutely, but that's what being a disciple is all about. It's being disciplined. Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. Number 4, was Jesus encouraging mutilation of the body in Matthew 29 and 30? No. See number 5. See question 5, which is how did Jesus use hyperbole in Matthew 5:27 through 30? Remember, hyperbole is an exaggerated statement or claim that is not to be taken literally. So, how did he use the hyperbole? If your eye is causing you to go astray, remember, the eye is part of 1 John, the 2nd or 3rd chapter, which is it that talks about the three forms of sin, okay? Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, okay? And if it's a problem for you, better to tear it out than to lose your soul, okay? Same thing with cutting off one's hand. But those are figures of speech. They are not to be taken literally. Okay, number 6 on the individual study guide was not on the Bible class discussion questions, And it is, what did Jesus quote from Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4? No, Deuteronomy, the fourth verse of Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter was about, he said, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to issue a certificate of divorce. That's what Jesus was quoting from when he said that. Okay? All right. That was on, that's still on page 236 in your book. Now we go to page 237. Number 7, which is also not on the Bible class discussion question. Some scribes had interpreted Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 to justify what? That's right. Divorce for any reason you can remember. It says that if you have a wife and she does not find favor in your eyes, okay. The point being is that um, even though they thought that that was justification, it was not proper justification. So they used that, issue a certificate of divorce. All you had to do, regardless of the reason, send her away, give her a certificate of divorce, and everything's okay, which of course we know was not right. And then number 8 on the individual study guide was number 6 from the Bible class discussions. What is the only scriptural reason for divorce? Yeah. Pick out your word that you want to from whatever version you're reading. Fornication, sexual immorality, unchastity, okay? Unfaithfulness, okay? Adultery. They all mean the same thing. And that's on the part of either marriage partner. I've gotten to the point where I don't even like to use that term anymore, because our society has made that a profane term. On the part of either spouse. Okay? So it doesn't make any difference whether it's the husband or the wife. Unfaithfulness may result in divorce. Okay? All right. Anything else? Well, if you understand Jesus correctly, you're right, Jack. But if you understand Jesus correctly, that's exactly what he was telling them was, you know, you may have acted like it was a man's world back then, but it was never intended to be that way, because when God issued the commandment, do not commit adultery, he didn't say women don't commit adultery, So, and because of New Testament teaching, Galatians 3:28 specifically, we know that New Testament teaching applies equally to both genders, okay? And to all ethnic groups, to all people all over the world, no matter where they are. Okay? New Testament teaching applies to everyone equally. Okay? Any other questions or comments? Okay, so Sunday, I'm heading out to Irene and I'll be at the encampment for about a week and a half. Sunday, Charles will be back with you, and he's going to, on this Sunday, you'll do lesson 26, which is the 6th part of the Sermon on the Mount. How shall I treat others? And I can even tell you what our preacher is preaching about. Partiality, the enemy of God, right? So, the 24th, then that's on pages 237 to 240 in your book. We actually are going to cut a little bit early, and we might even have time to talk to each other before the kids get in here and Ezra does our devotional. Thank you very much.